Welcome to the deep dive. Today, we're plunging into a moment in history that sent, well, financial and political tremors worldwide. The 1973 oil crisis, what kicked it off. An oil embargo declared in October of that year by the Organization of Arab Petroleum Exporting Countries, OPEC.
Right, OPEC.
Their target, nations that had backed Israel during the Yom Kippur War.
Initially, yeah. Canada, Japan, the Netherlands, UK, US.
And the list grew, didn't it?
It did. Portugal, Rhodesia, South Africa got added later.
And the immediate impact was staggering oil prices nearly quadrupled.
Yeah, igniting what people often call the first oil shock.
Exactly. And for this deep dive, our mission is to really unravel the complexities of this pivotal event and understand its far-reaching consequences for you.
To do that, we'll be primarily exploring the comprehensive overview offered by the Wikipedia entry on the 1973 oil crisis. It's quite detailed.
Okay, let's unpack this. So even before the embargo hit, it sounds like the stage was already set, kind of, by a number of underlying factors.
No.
The Arab-Israeli conflict, obviously, with its series of wars like the Suez Crisis.
Which closed the canal for a bit, 56-57.
Right, and the Six-Day War, which kept it shut for a full 8 years until 75. That was a major element. But what else was going on, behind the scenes?
Well, what's fascinating to consider is the state of oil production right here in America. At that time,
Okay.
it had actually reached its peak in 1969 and has started to decline.
Really? As early as 69?
Yeah, so this meant the United States was becoming more and more dependent on bringing in oil from other countries.
Right.
By 1973, U.S. production, get this, it accounted for only about 16% of the oil being produced globally.
16%. Wow. That really puts into perspective just how vulnerable the U.S. economy had become. It's almost hard to imagine that level of dependence now.
It really is.
And I recall reading about a policy that might have actually contributed to that domestic decline, the Drain America First policy, Eisenhower's quotas on foreign oil.
Precisely. Those quotas, which were in place from 1959 to 1973, they were controversial.
Yeah.
Some experts argue that they did indeed play a role in sort of weakening U.S. oil production right before this hit.
Okay.
And you also had Nixon's policies adding to it.
Like what?
Well, in 1971, he introduced a price ceiling on oil. Now, maybe the intention was good, shield consumers.
Right.
But with demand rising and domestic production falling, it unfortunately just increased America's reliance on foreign imports. Then, in 73, the quota system itself was ended. And boom, between 1970 and 1973, U.S. crude oil imports nearly doubled.
Doubled. So the U.S. was getting significantly more reliant on imported oil just as this crisis was, brewing.
Exactly.
And all of this was happening during an era of incredibly cheap oil, wasn't it? Like, what was it, $1.80 a barrel for much of the 60s?
Yeah, around that. Crazy cheap by today's standards.
That must have really fueled a lot of economic growth, right?
It absolutely did. That inexpensive oil was a key driver of the post-World War II economic boom. Big time.
But we also need to consider the growing influence of OPEC.
Right. Organization of the Petroleum Exporting Countries. Founded back in 1960. Venezuela, Iraq, Saudi Arabia, Iran, Kuwait.
Was it powerful from the start?
Not really. It wasn't initially very effective. But by the early 70s, things started changing. You had political instability in Libya and Iraq.
Okay.
And increasing Soviet influence in the region. OPEC began to gain real muscle.
How so?
Well, the Tehran Price Agreement in 1971, that increased the posted price of oil. That was an early sign of this shifting power dynamic. OPEC was basically formed to coordinate policies and get more control over prices.
And then there's the Nixon shock in 71, when the dollar was no longer directly convertible to gold. How did that play into this complex picture?
Yeah, that's a critical piece,
Yeah.
a really critical piece. See, oil was priced in U.S. dollars.
Right.
So when the dollar's value weakened after the end of gold convertibility, the real income of the oil-producing nations went down.
Okay. So they were getting paid the same number in dollars, but those dollars bought less.
Essentially, yeah. Interestingly, OPEC was actually quite slow to adjust its prices to reflect this dollar depreciation initially.
Really?
Yeah. Up until the oil shock, the dollar price of oil had stayed pretty stable, even compared to other currencies and commodities. Like, imagine oil is priced in a currency tied to gold. Break that link, the currency's value gets shaky.
So the sellers eventually want more of that currency to feel like they're getting the same real value. Got it.
Exactly.
Okay, so we've got the backdrop. The ongoing Arab-Israeli conflict, declining U.S. oil production, rising imports, the end of cheap oil, stronger OPEC, and the Nixon shock messing with the dollar. Quite a cocktail.
It really was a perfect storm brewing.
Now let's delve into the countdown to the October War and the use of the oil weapon. It wasn't the first time Arab nations had tried using oil as leverage, was it?
No, not at all. There were attempts during the Suez Crisis back in '56 and the 1967 Arab-Israeli War.
But they didn't really work.
Most experts agree, yeah, those earlier embargoes were largely ineffective. Saudi Arabia, especially, had traditionally been pretty hesitant to link oil and politics.
Why was that?
Partly because there was oil available from non-Arab producers, and also, frankly, they relied on Western support.
But it sounds like things were changing, maybe especially with the shift in Egyptian leadership, from Nasser to Sadat.
Precisely. That was a huge shift. Sadat favored what he called a diplomacy of surprise.
Okay.
And he cultivated a very strong relationship with King Faisal of Saudi Arabia. Unlike the more secular Nasser, both Sadat and Faisal were devout Muslims, shared a strong personal bond.
Interesting connection.
Yeah, and apparently Henry Kissinger later admitted the U.S. kind of underestimated the importance of this Egyptian-Saudi alliance. They were too focused on the Vietnam peace talks.
Huh. And Sadat's diplomatic moves his initial outreach to the U.S., then turning back to the Soviet Union, that seems like it must have been a crucial period, too.
It was definitely volatile. Sadat kicked out Soviet military personnel in '72.
Right, signaling a move towards the U.S.
Yeah, hoping they'd pressure Israel to return the Sinai Peninsula.
Huh.
But when that didn't happen fast enough for him,
He turned back.
he turned back to the Soviets. Secured massive arms purchases financed largely by Saudi Arabia, by the way, getting ready for the '73 war.
And Faisal was apparently giving warnings to the U.S. this whole time, wasn't he, through his oil minister, Yamani?
Yes, absolutely. Yamani met with Kissinger in early '73, basically conveyed King Faisal's growing dissatisfaction with the U.S., his strong desire for America to pressure Israel to return territories captured in '67.
And Kissinger.
Well, Yamani claimed Kissinger sort of dismissed these warnings, brushed them off. And adding to this, the heads of 4 major American oil companies, people who talked directly with Faisal, they also cautioned Washington, said, look, this guy is serious.
But Kissinger wouldn't meet them.
Reportedly declined to even meet with them. The thinking inside the U.S. government at the time seems to have been that the Saudis were just bluffing.
Wow. That sounds like a pretty significant intelligence miscalculation then.
Looking back, absolutely, a major misread.
And then the Yom Kippur War erupts. October 6th, 1973. Egypt and Syria attack Israel. What was Faisal's immediate response?
Faisal expressed strong support for Egypt right away, and he pledged to deploy the oil weapon if it became necessary.
Okay.
Now, initially, Kissinger actually tried to delay U.S. arms shipments to Israel. He was viewing the conflict through that Cold War lens, especially after the Soviets began resupplying the Arab forces.
But that delay didn't last long.
No. Once Nixon authorized Operation Nickel Grass on October 12th, that was it. The massive U.S. airlift of weapons to Israel started.
And that seems to be the real trigger, the thing that directly kicked off the oil action.
It absolutely looks that way.
Right.
On October 16th, just days later, OPEC announced a huge price increase from $3.01 to $5.12 per barrel.
Wow, that's a big jump.
And they also demanded nationalization of U.S. oil assets.
Yeah.
Then the very next day, October 17th, OPEC, the Arab group within OPEC, implemented production cuts and the oil embargo.
Targeting who specifically again?
The U.S., Netherlands, Rhodesia, South Africa, and Portugal. And even though Nixon promised a peaceful, just, and honorable resolution, his request to Congress on October 19th for $2.2 billion in aid to Israel, well, that just ignited a really fierce Arab response.
So that was the final straw.
Seems like it. Saudi Arabia imposed a total oil embargo against the U.S. on October 20th. Most other Arab oil producers followed suit pretty quickly, and they started gradual monthly production cuts that eventually reached 25% of September levels by December.
25% cut, that's huge. So the oil weapon was fully engaged. How effective was this embargo ultimately in achieving its aims?
Well, the embargo itself officially lasted from October 73 to March 74.
Okay.
During this time, Kissinger met with both Sadat and Faisal, and those meetings sound intense. Faisal apparently had these deep-seated anti-communist and anti-Zionist beliefs, even citing the protocols of the learned elders of Zion.
Really? Wow.
Yeah, and initially there was even serious consideration within the U.S. government, specifically Defense Secretary Schlesinger, of military intervention.
To do what? Seize the oil fields.
Yeah. Exactly. Invade Saudi Arabia, Kuwait, Abu Dhabi.
Kissinger made some private comments about it too.
Good grief. That's sobering.
Extremely. It shows how high the stakes felt. But the plan was ultimately abandoned.
Why?
Diplomacy won out, partly because the CIA confirmed Saudi threats were credible. They said they would cut production further, maybe even set fire to their own oil fields if the U.S. invaded.
So they called the bluff, essentially, or showed it wasn't a bluff.
Right. So military action was off the table. Kissinger did threaten publicly, but the Saudis threatened right back.
So diplomacy continued. How did Kissinger's meeting with Faisal in Riyadh go?
Not, well, in terms of getting the embargo lifted immediately. Kissinger apparently promised a more even-handed U.S. approach, but Faisal wasn't convinced right away.
What did Faisal say?
He voiced these long-standing criticisms of U.S. bias towards Israel, gave this whole historical perspective on Arab-Jewish relations. He actually became something of a hero in the Islamic world during this period, hailed at a summit in Lahore. So, what finally did lead to the lifting of the embargo in March 1974, if not that meeting?
It seems like a few things came together. Sadat reported back that he felt the U.S. was starting to be more even-handed.
Okay.
Kissinger also made promises about future U.S. arms sales to Saudi Arabia, something they'd wanted but been denied before.
Ah, a carrot.
Maybe. But perhaps even more significantly, Saudi Arabia had huge financial interests in the West by then. All that oil money.
Right.
And the massive inflation caused by the oil shock itself was starting to erode the value of their investments. So they had a pretty strong self-interest in seeing the crisis resolved and the global economy stabilize.
Makes sense. So was the embargo actually successful in changing the policies of the targeted countries? It sounds like there's some debate.
There definitely is. Some historians and economists argue, look, it failed to achieve major shifts in the official policies of, say, the U.S. or the Netherlands.
So it's more bark than bite, policy-wise?
That's one view. They'd say any long-term impacts were more down to OPEC's dramatic price increases, not the OPEC embargo specifically.
But others disagree.
Oh, yeah. Others, like the energy historian Daniel Yergin, argue the embargo fundamentally remade the international economy, full stop.
Okay.
And regardless of the specific policy changes, you can't deny the facts on the ground. There was a huge reduction in oil exports to the West.
How much?
Estimates are around 60 to 70% reduction by November 73, because so many Arab producers participated.
Wow.
And that scarcity, combined with consumers suddenly being willing to pay way higher prices, well, it drove prices sky high. We saw auction bids hitting $17 a barrel.
From $3 just months before.
Exactly. And then OPEC announced another official price increase in December 73 to $11.65 per barrel. Apparently, Faisal actually opposed that specific price hike, but it happened anyway.
So massive disruption, massive price hikes. What were the longer-term effects?
Huge. It spurred a massive increase in oil exploration in non-OPEC countries. Think North Sea, Alaska.
Right. Diversification.
Exactly. It accelerated research into alternative energy sources, pushed energy conservation measures much harder, and contributed to more restrictive monetary policies in Western economies trying to fight that inflation.
So the effects of this crisis just radiated outwards in so many different directions. Let's try and unpack some of those impacts. What was the immediate effect on the oil exporting nations themselves, besides getting rich?
Well, yes, they experienced this rapid, massive accumulation of wealth, huge amounts of capital flooding in.
What do they do with it?
A mix of things. Some increased aid to other developing nations. There were significant arms purchases across the board. In Saudi Arabia specifically, a lot of funding went into propagating Wahhabism globally. You also saw these incredibly ambitious, sometimes maybe too ambitious, development projects announced in places like Iran, Venezuela, Nigeria.
And politically.
Increased global influence for nations like Algeria. A renewed global focus on the Palestinian issue, with much more funding going to the PLO, the Palestine Liberation Organization.
Yeah.
And Arab leaders found themselves in more frequent diplomatic meetings, holding more sway.
But it wasn't all positive for them.
No, definitely not. This sudden influx of massive wealth also created serious internal challenges. In Saudi Arabia, it arguably contributed to a fundamentalist backlash later on.
Like the Grand Mosque seizure.
Exactly. Events like that. And it certainly played a role in the complex factors leading up to the Iranian Revolution and unrest in places like Algeria.
And control over the oil itself.
That was a big outcome. Many OPEC nations moved towards nationalizing the holdings of the big Western oil companies operating in their countries, gaining much greater direct control over their own natural resources.
Okay. And the oil weapon itself? Did it ultimately achieve that specific goal of pushing targeted governments towards a more pro-Arab stance?
That's still debated. As we said, it caused that huge 25% production cut, massive economic anxiety.
For sure.
But did it lead to, say, the U.S. suddenly reversing its policy overnight? Probably not. The U.S. might have been just as concerned, maybe more concerned, about preventing the Middle East from becoming a new Cold War battleground with the Soviets.
Right.
But even if official policies didn't do a 180, that intense pressure and economic pain, it almost certainly had a more subtle, long-term influence on political calculations in those targeted nations.
Okay. What about the direct impact on the United States? We felt it hard, right?
Oh, absolutely.
Yeah.
The U.S. experienced recession, significant inflation, that really nasty combination called stagflation.
Yeah. Slow growth and high inflation. Awful.
Right. Reduced productivity, lower overall economic growth for years. The crisis starkly highlighted just how vulnerable U.S. energy security was.
And specific industries?
American industries, especially the automotive sector with its big cars, faced huge competitive disadvantages almost overnight.
Because of gas prices.
Exactly. Gasoline prices soared. They went up by a staggering 43% in just 1 year. Average driver felt that big time.
So what did people do? What did the government do?
Widespread conservation measures kicked in. Things like discouraging Christmas lights. Can you imagine the headlines today?
No kidding.
Public calls for rationing. President Nixon launched Project Independence.
What was that?
The goal was achieving energy self-sufficiency, mainly through pushing nuclear energy and boosting domestic fossil fuels. But that faced its own set of challenges and limitations down the road.
And socially.
Interestingly, the oil shock also fueled a noticeable wave of anti-Arab sentiment within the U.S.
It's striking how profoundly it impacted everyday life. Even Christmas lights. What about the Soviet Union? They weren't targeted by the embargo? Were they beneficiaries somehow?
You'd think maybe, but surprisingly, not really. The crisis actually prompted the USSR to raise energy prices within its own economic bloc, CMEA, the Council for Mutual Economic Assistance.
Okay, what?
Well, the global price went up, so they raised their prices too. But this caused real economic difficulties for their Eastern European allies.
How so?
Because those countries then had to buy oil from the Middle East anyway at the much higher world market prices, putting a huge strain on their economies. So not a clear win for the Soviets.
Interesting. And Western Europe, you mentioned the impact varied quite a bit there.
It really did. The Netherlands got hit with a complete oil embargo. They were seen as particularly pro-Israel.
Okay.
But the UK and France, they had relatively uninterrupted supplies. Why? Largely because of their stance on letting the U.S. use their airfields for the airlift to Israel. They were more cautious or outright refused in France's case.
So diplomacy mattered there.
Definitely. Other members of the EEC, the European Economic Community, the precursor to the EU, faced partial cutbacks.
And what measures did they take?
Some countries banned Sunday driving, even boating. There was gasoline and heating oil rationing in places.
And politically within Europe?
Well, the crisis seemed to cause nations to look inwards a bit, focus on their own problems, which might have actually hindered further European integration at that specific moment, everyone scrambling for themselves.
But it also pushed alternatives.
Yes, absolutely. Big time. Increased interest in nuclear energy as a way to reduce that dependence on foreign oil, especially in France.
Yeah.
They went heavily into nuclear after this.
Now, the UK seems to have had a particularly tough time, even without a direct embargo hitting them as hard as the Netherlands.
Indeed. They were heavily reliant on imported oil anyway, so the quadrupling of prices hit the British economy hard. Very hard.
What happened?
The government turned towards coal as an alternative. But this empowered the coal miners' unions, leading to major strikes.
Ah, the miner strikes.
Exactly. Which significantly contributed to the downfall of Prime Minister Edward Heath's government in early '74. There was a genuine energy crisis, rationing, the whole 3-day week thing at one point, a very difficult period.
And Japan, you mentioned their high dependence on Middle East oil.
Severely affected. They imported something like 90% of their oil from the Middle East at the time.
Yeah.
Huge vulnerability.
So what did they do?
They implemented significant consumption cuts across society, faced substantial inflation. Interestingly, the Soviet Union tried to use the crisis to gain leverage over those disputed Kuril Islands.
Did it work?
Nope. Japan firmly resisted. Instead, Japan provided big loans to Arab states and publicly called for Israeli withdrawal from the occupied territories. a clear policy shift.
And long-term for Japan.
Long-term, this crisis was a huge catalyst. It spurred Japan to diversify its oil sources away from just the Middle East, invest very heavily in nuclear power, push energy conservation like crazy, and provide financial aid to Arab governments.
And their famous auto industry.
Ah, yes. Ironically, Japanese automakers really benefited. As consumers in the West, especially the U.S., suddenly panic about gas prices.
Who wanted smaller, fuel-efficient cars.
Exactly. And who made those? Japanese companies like Toyota, Honda, Datsun. Their market share exploded. It was a massive turning point for the global auto industry.
Can you give us a sense of just how dramatic that shift was? Were there iconic examples of vehicles that rose or fell?
Well, think about the classic big American gas guzzlers of the early 70s, the huge Cadillacs, Lincolns, Chevys. Demand for those just plummeted. Dealerships were stuck with them.
Right.
Meanwhile, imports like the Honda Civic, which was tiny but sipped gas, or the Toyota Corolla, they suddenly looked incredibly attractive. They couldn't import them fast enough. And in Europe, you saw the rise of the Super Mini or the compact hatchback, like the VW Golf, which launched right around this time. It perfectly captured that need for efficiency.
Fascinating. What about other regions mentioned in the source, India and South Vietnam?
In India, the oil crisis definitely worsened existing economic problems. It's seen as one factor contributing to Indira Gandhi imposing the emergency in '75, and it led to a renewed push for using India's own coal reserves as a primary energy source.
And South Vietnam. That sounds grim.
It was devastating for them. Their economy was already fragile, heavily dependent on U.S. aid. The oil shock crippled it further, and U.S. aid was also being reduced around then. Double whammy. Exactly. Plus, the Viet Cong specifically targeted fuel depots in their attacks. All this contributed to really low morale in the South Vietnamese Army, the ARVN, and played a significant role in the final collapse of South Vietnam in 1975.
Wow. The ripple effects are just incredible. In Southern Africa,
Yeah.
Portugal, South Africa, Rhodesia were all targeted somehow.
Yes. For Portugal, the worldwide inflation triggered by the oil crisis hit their Estado Novo regime hard. It weakened them significantly, contributing to the Carnation Revolution in '74 and the subsequent independence of their African colonies, except Macau.
Okay.
In South Africa, the crisis derailed their industrialization efforts, adding to economic stress, which had social and political consequences. Events like the Soweto uprising in '76 are seen partly in this context.
And Rhodesia.
Rhodesia's economy was already struggling under UN sanctions. The oil shock devastated it further, making things much harder, exacerbating white flight, and definitely contributing to the pressures that eventually led to the end of white minority rule there.
Okay, let's circle back to the U.S. for a moment. Those price controls and rationing measures. It sounds like they created their own set of problems, almost like unintended consequences.
Oh, they certainly did. Classic example. Price controls on domestically produced old oil from existing wells, actually made this scarcity worse.
How?
Because it limited the price, making it less profitable to sell. It discouraged investment in producing more oil domestically or exploring alternatives.
Yeah.
Why bother if the price is capped artificially low?
Right. And the rationing.
The rationing system led to those infamous long lines at gas stations. Chaos. The odd-even license plate days for buying gas, the little flags pumps used to show if they had gas.
I remember pictures of those lines.
Yeah. It even triggered trucker strikes because they couldn't get reliable fuel allocations. And price controls also affected natural gas, leading to dwindling reserves there, too.
But on the flip side, it also spurred some positive changes in terms of conservation and looking for alternative energy.
Absolutely. That's the other side of the coin. The crisis forced a reckoning. The national maximum speed limit of 55 miles per hour was introduced primarily to save fuel.
The double nickel.
That's the one. There was an experiment with year-round daylight saving time, though that didn't stick long-term. Public awareness campaigns like Don't Be Fuelish popped up everywhere, encouraging voluntary conservation.
And for cars.
Big changes. The corporate average fuel economy standards CAFE were established, forcing automakers to improve fuel efficiency across their fleets. And as we discussed, consumers shifted dramatically away from large, gas-guzzling cars towards smaller, more efficient models. We saw new government programs like the Weatherization Assistance Program to help low-income households insulate their homes better.
And the push for alternatives.
Definitely got a boost. Interest in renewables, solar, wind nuclear power, and developing domestic fossil fuels like coal and offshore oil all increased significantly.
Any specific examples internationally?
Well, Brazil launched its huge pro-alcohol project, pushing ethanol fuel made from sugarcane on a massive scale. And Israel, needing energy security, became a real leader in developing and deploying solar water heaters, which became very common there.
Okay. And zooming out again, the macroeconomy, what was the bigger picture?
Well, as we mentioned, the Western world largely experienced stagflation. Central banks initially responded, perhaps mistakenly, by cutting interest rates, which might have fueled inflation further before they slammed on the brakes later.
And all that oil money going to OPEC nations.
It created huge current account deficits in the oil importing economies, but it also led to the development of what's called the petrodollar recycling mechanism.
How did that work,
It's
basically?
essentially oil exporting nations, flush with dollars, invested those surplus dollars in Western banks, banks in New York, London, etc.
Okay.
Those banks then lent those dollars out, often back to the oil importing nations, including developing countries, who needed to finance their oil imports and deficits. It kept the money flowing, but also created new debt dependencies.
And the oil companies themselves.
Oh, they saw a massive rise in their prominence and profits. Suddenly, oil companies dominated the top spots in the Fortune 500 rankings. Their power grew significantly.
Finally, let's talk about how this crisis reshaped international relations on a wider scale. It sounds like it really shook up alliances.
It definitely did. It caused a significant rift within NATO.
How so?
European nations and Japan grew wary of being dragged into Middle East conflicts by U.S. policy. They started distancing themselves, trying to pursue their own relationships with Arab states. Remember France and the U.K. not allowing use of airfields? That was part of it.
Right.
The U.S., in turn, intensified its efforts to mediate a lasting peace in the Arab-Israeli conflict, leading to Kissinger's shuttle diplomacy.
And we mentioned the U.S. considered military action briefly.
Yes, declassified documents confirmed that. The idea of seizing oil fields was seriously, if briefly, contemplated at the highest levels. Shows the panic.
So European policies shifted.
Western Europe, and Canada too, generally shifted towards more pro-Arab policies, or at least more neutral ones, trying to secure their own oil supplies. Japan, as we said, also adjusted its diplomatic stance significantly towards Arab states.
Any other global shifts?
You saw the emergence of a stronger bloc of Latin American nations expressing opposition to U.S. influence. The United Nations even issued a call for a new international economic order, trying to reshape global economic power away from just the dominant Western nations.
Oh, the Cold War.
It disrupted some existing Cold War alignments in the Middle East. It also led to increased U.S. security guarantees and massive arms sales to allies in the Persian Gulf region like Saudi Arabia and Iran under the Shah, trying to ensure stability in oil flow.
And some argue longer-term impacts on the region itself.
Some analysts definitely argue that the crisis, the influx of wealth, the geopolitical shifts maybe contributed indirectly to the rise of Islamist radicalism in the region in the following decades, a very complex legacy.
And the auto industry, just to recap that.
A global, permanent shift towards smaller, more fuel-efficient cars, the rise of compact hatchbacks in Europe, the dominance of Japanese imports in the U.S. market, forced American automakers to eventually respond with smaller models. It changed car design and priorities forever.
So wrapping up the consequences, did OPEC remain all-powerful?
Interestingly, no, not indefinitely. The high prices spurred so much new production by non-OPEC members. The North Sea, Alaska, Mexico, Siberia later on.
The supply increased elsewhere.
Exactly. Plus conservation worked, demand moderated, and OPEC itself faced internal divisions over pricing and production quotas. By the 1980s, you actually saw a significant oil price drop, the oil glut.
Right.
And the diversification into alternative energy sources, while maybe slower than hope, continued. But for some heavily populated oil-dependent exporting countries, when those prices eventually fell in the 80s, it caused serious economic problems because they'd become so reliant on that high income.
So the 1973 oil crisis was clearly far, far more than just, a temporary inconvenience at the gas pump.
Indeed. It wasn't just long lines for gas. It served as a profound shock. A shock that fundamentally reshaped the global economy, international relations, even the fabric of our daily lives.
Yeah, from the kinds of cars we started driving to the energy sources we rely on or try to develop.
Exactly.
The echoes of this first oil shock, you can still feel them today, can't you? In all the ongoing discussions and debates about energy independence, geopolitical power, climate change, economic stability.
Absolutely. It really underscores the interconnectedness of everything. How a regional conflict, seemingly localized, could spark such a massive global economic crisis.
Makes you wonder what other seemingly localized issues out there today might have that kind of far-reaching potential in our even more interconnected world now.
That's the question to ponder. This deep dive has offered, I hope, a glimpse into a truly pivotal moment in modern history. For you listening, what aspects of this crisis pique your curiosity the most? What related topics might you now want to explore in greater detail? Welcome to the Deep Dive, where your curiosity guides us, you send us the sources, and, well, we dive into them together to pull out the key insights.
And today, we're going way, way back.
We really are. We're tackling the Epic of Gilgamesh, using its Wikipedia page as our starting point, our map, if you will.
It's just incredible how old the story is. I mean, we're talking about an epic poem from ancient Mesopotamia. Its literary history, it seems to start with 5 Sumerian poems.
Sumerian first, okay.
Yeah, about King Gilgamesh of Uruk, maybe called Bilgames back then. And these could date possibly to around 2100 BCE.
Wow. So these Sumerian poems, they're like the first seeds of the epic.
Exactly. Think of them maybe as standalone stories that later got woven together. The next big step was this more unified epic in Akkadian.
Akkadian, the language that came after Sumerian.
That's the one. And the oldest version we have of that is from the old Babylonian period, maybe 18th century BCE. It's known by its first line, surpassing all other kings.
Surpassing all other kings. I like that. Do we have much of it?
Sadly, no. Just fragments, really, of that early Akkadian version.
So that brings us to the version most people know, the standard Babylonian one.
Yes, exactly. That's the standard Babylonian version. It was likely compiled by a scribe named Sinlucky Unini.
Sinlucky Unine.
Got it. Sometime between, say, the 13th and 10th centuries BCE. And its opening line is just fantastic. He who saw the deep.
He who saw the deep. Gives you chills, doesn't it?
It really does. And we've actually recovered about 2/3 of its 12 tablets. Remarkably, some of the best copies came from the library of Ashurbanipal.
The Assyrian king from the 7th century BCE.
That's him. Just imagine this story was important enough to be kept in a royal library all those thousands of years ago.
It's quite a journey for a story from separate Sumerian tales to this connected Akkadian epic, and then a nearly complete version in a king's library. Amazing.
It really is.
So our goal today is to basically trace that core story, figure out the key themes, and, understand why this ancient work still grabs us. Ready to jump in?
Absolutely. Let's start at the beginning with Gilgamesh himself and his rather unique companion.
Right. So we meet Gilgamesh, king of Uruk, and he's not entirely human. Is he 2/3 god?
2/3 god, 1/3 man. So almost divine, but his rule, at least initially, it wasn't exactly easy on his people.
That sounds like an understatement. What was he doing?
Well, Epic paints him as, frankly, an oppressor. It talks about him claiming the right to sleep with brides on their wedding night.
Seriously? Wow.
Yeah. And while some parts are fragmented, it also suggests he wore out the young men of Uruk, maybe through forced labor on his big building projects or demanding physical contests.
Okay, so the people of Uruk are suffering. They need help. And the gods, they respond.
They do. Their answer is to create Enkidu, a wild man.
Wild how?
Created deliberately as Gilgamesh's equal in strength, someone who could maybe stand up to him. He starts out completely primal, covered in hair, living in the wild with animals.
Roaming free.
Exactly. But his wildness actually disrupts things. He messes up a trapper's livelihood by breaking his traps.
So nature versus, well, early civilization maybe.
Kinda, yeah. The trapper gets frustrated and goes for help. He finds Shamhat.
Shamhat. She's described as a temple prostitute.
Yes. She goes out to the wilderness, finds Enkidu, and, well, through an encounter, the text says 6 days and 7 nights. Though maybe longer, she tames him.
Tames him.
How does that work? It's a transition. This encounter shifts him from being purely animalistic to something more human. Afterwards, the animals, as his old companions, they shy away from him.
He feels alienated.
A bit, yeah. But Shamhat reassures him, tells him he's gained wisdom now, he's like the gods. It's fascinating, this idea that knowledge, connection, it separates you from that pure state of nature.
That's a huge moment for him. Becoming human in a way. What happens next? How does he meet Gilgamesh?
Well, Shamhat takes him to some shepherds first. He learns more human ways, gets his hair cut, eats cooked food, drinks beer, starts fitting in. But then he hears about Gilgamesh, specifically about him taking the brides. And Enkidu, now with this maybe sense of justice, he decides he has to go to Uruk and confront the king.
Right, the showdown.
Yeah.
Two incredibly powerful figures about to clash.
You got it. Gilgamesh tries to go into the bridal chamber, and Enkidu blocks his path. They wrestle fiercely.
A massive fight.
Huge. It goes on for a while. Eventually, Enkidu has to admit Gilgamesh is stronger, but here's the twist you might not expect.
No.
Instead of becoming bitter rivals, they become friends. Deep friends.
Really? After trying to beat each other up?
It seems so. Maybe it's that mutual respect, recognizing each other's power. But whatever it is, they form this incredibly strong bond, loyalty, affection.
That's unexpected.
Right.
So what do these new best friends decide to do?
Well, almost immediately, Gilgamesh proposes an adventure, a big one. Let's go to the cedar forest, he says, and kill its guardian, the monster Humbaba.
Humbaba? Why? What's the point?
Fame, lasting renown. To make a name for themselves that will echo through time.
Ah, the classic hero motivation. But surely someone must have thought this was a bad idea.
Oh, absolutely. And Enkidu himself, he knows Humbaba is terrifying. And the city elders in Uruk, they strongly advise against it. They warn Gilgamesh about the dangers.
He doesn't listen.
Nope. He's determined, set on going. It really speaks to that human drive, doesn't it? For recognition, for leaving a mark.
So off they go towards this mythical forest. What happens on the way?
The journey itself isn't super detailed in the epic, but it mentions mountains and these nightly dream rituals. Gilgamesh has 5 really disturbing dreams.
Disturbing how?
Like visions of mountains falling, huge thunderstorms, charging bulls, a scary fire-breathing thunderbird. Really unsettling stuff.
Sounds like terrible omens. Didn't Enkidu agree? Did he say, maybe we should turn back?
You'd think so, wouldn't you? But no. Despite how scary they sound and maybe some similarities to Humbaba, Enkidu consistently tells Gilgamesh they're good signs.
Good signs.
Yeah. He just interprets them positively, reassures Gilgamesh, dismisses the danger. Even as they get closer and actually hear Humbaba roaring, they have to pump each other up, keep their fear in check.
Wow. Belief and courage carrying them forward.
Yeah. So they finally arrive, face to face with Humbaba.
Yep. And Humbaba is not happy to see them. He insults them, threatens them, accuses Enkidu of being a traitor to the wild, promises Gilgamesh a horrible death.
So Gilgamesh must be terrified again.
He is, initially, but Enkidu encourages him, shores up his resolve, and the fight begins. It's apparently so massive the ground shakes, the sky goes dark.
An epic battle. And don't the gods get involved here?
They do. Shamash, the sun god, he sees them struggling and sends 13 powerful winds. These winds basically trap Humbaba, immobilize him.
Okay, so they've got him. What happens then?
Humbaba, captured, pleads for his life.
Yes.
Desperately. He offers to be Gilgamesh's servant, king of the forest under him, promises to cut down trees, be his slave forever.
Does Gilgamesh consider it? Showing mercy?
For a moment, yes,
Yeah.
he seems moved. But then Enkidu steps in. Ugh! What does Enkidu say?
He argues forcefully. Kill him now! This is your chance for ultimate fame, eternal glory. Don't let it slip away.
And Gilgamesh listens to Enkidu.
He does. Swayed by Enkidu, by the desire for fame, he ignores Humbaba's pleas and kills him. Some versions say they kill his 7 sons too.
Brutal. And then
Then they cut down loads of cedar trees, including one enormous one that Enkidu plans to make into a huge door for the god Enlil's temple. They build a raft, float back down the Euphrates to Uruk, maybe with Humbaba's head as a trophy.
So they return to Uruk, basically heroes, right? Having pulled off this massive feat.
Totally celebrated. But, their troubles aren't exactly over. This is where the goddess Ishtar steps in.
Ah, Ishtar, right. The goddess of love and war.
That's her. And flushed with victory, Gilgamesh, he really attracts her attention. She's drawn to his strength, his looks.
And she makes a move.
She does. Proposes he become her lover, but Gilgamesh, he turns her down flat. And pretty bluntly, too.
Oh. He wasn't subtle?
Not at all. He basically throws her history back in her face, reminds her how badly she treated previous lovers, like Dumuzi specifically. Calls her out on being fickle and destructive.
Ouch. So a goddess scorned. That can't end well.
Exactly. Ishtar is furious, absolutely enraged.
Yeah.
She storms off to her father, Anu, the top god, and demands he send the Bull of Heaven down.
The Bull of Heaven. To punish Gilgamesh.
Yep, to punish Gilgamesh, avenge her pride. Anu hesitates at first. He warns her, unleashing the bull means 7 years of famine for Uruk.
A high price?
A very high price. But Ishtar says she's got it covered, claims she has enough provisions stored up, so Anu reluctantly agrees.
And the bull is unleashed. What does it do?
Chaos. Pure destruction. It's this monstrous creature, drinks the river dry, opens up huge cracks in the earth that swallow hundreds of people. It's a total catastrophe for Uruk.
Unbelievable devastation. How on earth do Gilgamesh and Enkidu handle that?
This time, it's just them, no divine help. They face the bull together, relying on their own strength and courage. After a massive struggle, they manage to kill it.
They kill the bull of heaven.
Wow, they do. They offer its heart to Shamash, the sun god. And then Enkidu, in this ultimate act of defiance towards Ishtar, rips off the bull's hindquarter and throws it at her.
Throws part of the dead bull at the goddess.
Yeah, a direct insult. The city celebrates, of course, they're saved again. But Enkidu, he has a bad dream, an ominous one. It hints that there's a price to pay for all this.
A price for killing Humbaba and now the bull of heaven. What was the dream about?
In the dream, the gods are meeting, Anu, Enlil, Shamash. They decide that killing Humbaba and the bull, well, it crossed a line. One of the heroes has to die.
One of them. But Shamash helped them with Humbaba.
Exactly. And Shamash argues for them, protests, but the decision is made. And tragically, it's Enkidu who is marked for death.
Enkidu. Not Gilgamesh. That seems arbitrary, unfair.
It does. It really highlights how the gods' decisions could seem capricious from a human perspective. Enkidu is devastated, obviously.
How does he react?
At first, he's bitter. He curses the cedar door he made so proudly. He curses the trapper who found him, curses Shamhat for bringing him into the human world.
Blaming everyone for his fate.
Understandably. But then Shamash speaks to him, reminds him of the good things Shamhat brought: food, clothes, and most importantly, his friendship with Gilgamesh.
Oh.
Shamash also tells him how much Gilgamesh will mourn him, the honors he'll receive. And this seems to reach Enkidu. He takes back his curses, especially the one against Shamhat, and blesses her instead.
That's quite moving. A moment of acceptance.
It seems like it. Acceptance, gratitude for the life he did have, but his fate is sealed.
So he gets sick.
Yes. He has another dream first, a terrifying one about the netherworld. This house of dust, darkness, where people eat clay and wear feathers.
Grim stuff.
The Mesopotamian afterlife. Sounds bleak.
Very. Then, over 12 days, he gets weaker and weaker. He laments that he's dying in bed, not heroically in battle. And then he dies.
Oh, man. Gilgamesh must have been absolutely shattered. They're inseparable. Completely devastated. The epic describes his grief so powerfully. It says he clings to Enkidu's body, just refusing to believe he's dead, until a maggot falls from Enkidu's nose.
Oh, that's graphic, but so real. The undeniable sign.
Exactly. That stark reality hits him, and his grief just pours out. He delivers this huge lament, calling on everyone and everything to mourn Enkidu, tears his clothes, his hair.
Just raw grief.
Absolutely. He recalls all their adventures together. He commissions a magnificent statue of Enkidu, provides all sorts of treasures for his grave, hoping to give him a good standing in the underworld.
Trying to do right by him, even in death.
Yeah. There's even a hint he might have dammed a river for the burial, which lines up with some other Sumerian texts about Gilgamesh's own death, interestingly. But this whole experience, losing Enkidu, it changes Gilgamesh fundamentally.
How so? What does it trigger in him?
Well, seeing Enkidu die forces Gilgamesh to confront his own mortality, really face it for the first time, and it terrifies him.
The fear of death.
It's an overwhelming fear. He becomes obsessed with escaping it, so he decides he has to find Utnapishtim.
Utnapishtim, the guy who survived the Great Flood, the immortal one.
That's him, the faraway, the only human the gods ever granted eternal life. Gilgamesh thinks if anyone knows the secret, it's him. So he sets off on this incredibly dangerous journey to find him.
Driven purely by grief and this new terror of dying, what kind of dangers does he face on this quest?
It's seriously perilous. He travels through mountains in darkness, fights and kills lions wearing their skins, maybe as a reminder of death or just for protection. Eventually, he reaches Mount Mashu, the twin peaks at the edge of the world.
Guarded by monsters, I bet.
You got it. 2 terrifying scorpion monsters, a husband and wife team. They guard the tunnel the sun travels through at night, a place no mortal has ever passed through.
Scorpion monsters. How does he get past them?
The male scorpion tries to warn him off, tells him it's hopeless, but the female scorpion, she shows some compassion. She sees his desperation, and apparently she convinces her husband to let him pass.
Wow, so he goes into this dark tunnel.
He does. Plunges into total darkness following the sun's path. For 12 double hours, just pitch black. He barely makes it out the other side before the sun comes through. It's incredible he survives.
And where does he emerge?
Into this amazing, luminous garden of the gods. Trees bearing jewels instead of fruit. Just breathtaking. It shows his incredible willpower, maybe a bit of divine luck, too.
So after all that, is Utnapishtim waiting for him there?
Not quite yet. First, he runs into Siduri. She's an alewife, runs a tavern by the sea.
An alewife, like a barmaid.
Pretty much. She's suspicious at first. Gilgamesh looks rough, wild after his journey. She thinks maybe he's a killer. But he tells her his whole story, Enkidu's death, his quest.
Does she help him?
She feels sorry for him, but she also tries to talk him out of it. Tells him basically, look, seeking immortality is pointless. Embrace mortal life. Enjoy your family, your city. That's what humans are meant to do.
Sensible advice. Does he take it?
Nope. He's still obsessed. So Siduri, seeing she can't change his mind, points him towards Urshanabi.
Urshanabi. Who's he?
He's the ferryman, the only one who can cross the waters of death that separate the mortal world from where Utnapishtim lives.
The waters of death. Sounds ominous. But Gilgamesh messes things up with Urshanabi, doesn't he?
He does. In a fit of rage, we don't know exactly why he smashes these sacred stone charms, the very things Urshanabi needs to navigate the waters of death safely because they're lethal to touch.
Oh no, so how do they cross?
Big mistake. Urshanabi tells him what he's done and makes him cut down 120 trees to use as punting poles. One pole per push, then discard it immediately so he doesn't touch the deadly water. A huge amount of extra work caused by his own anger.
Talk about making things harder for yourself. But he does it. He gets across.
He does it. It takes immense effort, but they finally reach the island where Utnapishtim and his wife live. Gilgamesh, totally exhausted, pours out his story again, begs for the secret to eternal life.
And what does Utnapishtim say? Does he just hand it over?
Not at all. Utnapishtim is kind of world-weary about it. He basically tells Gilgamesh off for fighting against fate, against mortality. Says that by trying to escape death, he's actually cheapening life.
Oof. Not the answer he wanted. So Utnapishtim explains how he got immortality. Tells the flood story.
Exactly. He tells the whole story. How the gods decided to flood the world, wipe out humanity. But one god, Enki, secretly warned him.
Enki? Why?
He was maybe more sympathetic to humans. He told Utnapishtim to build a huge boat, gave him the exact dimensions, told him to seal it tight. Utnapishtim loaded up his family, craftsmen, animals.
Sounds familiar.
Extremely familiar. Then the storm hits, rages for 6 days and nights, so bad even the gods got scared. Ishtar apparently cried seeing humanity destroyed.
The flood ends. The boat lands on a mountain.
Mount Nimush, according to this version. He sends out birds, a dove, a swallow, then a raven. When the raven doesn't come back, he knows there's dry land.
Just like Noah's story. The parallels are incredible.
They really are. Utnapishtim makes a sacrifice. The gods smell it. Ishtar vows never to forget the flood. And Lil, the head god who caused the flood, is furious at first that anyone survived.
But he changes his mind.
Yeah. Ishtar and Enki basically tell him off for being so excessive. So Enlil relents and gives Utnapishtim and his wife immortality. But, and this is the key point for Gilgamesh, it was a unique, one-off gift, not a secret anyone else can learn.
So, tough luck for Gilgamesh. Immortality isn't on the cards.
Pretty much. And to really drive the point home, Utnapishtim gives Gilgamesh a test. A simple one. Just stay awake for 6 days and 7 nights.
Can he do it? After everything he's been through?
Nope. He's exhausted, emotionally and physically, falls asleep almost immediately. Utnapishtim's wife bakes a loaf of bread for every day he sleeps. When Gilgamesh wakes up, he sees the loaves, some fresh, some stale, some moldy. Proof he couldn't even conquer sleep, let alone death.
Wow. That's a harsh but effective way to make a point. Utterly humbling. So is that it? Quest over?
Almost. As Gilgamesh is about to leave, totally defeated, Utnapishtim's wife feels sorry for him. She nudges her husband to give him something.
A consolation prize.
Sort of. Utnapishtim tells him about a special plant at the bottom of the ocean. It doesn't grant immortality, but it can restore youth. Make you young again.
Whoa. So there's still hope for something. Rejuvenation.
Renewed hope, exactly. Gilgamesh is determined. He ties stones to his feet, dives down, finds the plant. He's ecstatic. Thinks he'll take it back to Uruk, test it on an old man, then use it himself.
He finally got something.
Yeah.
But I have a bad feeling about this.
Yeah.
Does he make it back with the plan?
Ah, you guessed it. The final cruel twist. On the way back, he stops to bathe in a cool spring. Leaves the plant on the bank.
Oh no. Don't tell me.
A serpent smells it, slithers over, eats the plant, and as it eats it, the snake sheds its skin, becoming young again right before Gilgamesh's eyes.
Are you kidding me? The snake gets the prize. He loses it just like that.
Just like that. The symbol of rejuvenation is literally stolen from him. Gilgamesh just breaks down, weeps, realizes it's All been for nothing. His quest has completely failed.
Utterly heartbreaking. After everything.
Oh.
So he just gives up and goes home.
Dejectedly, yes. He returns to Uruk with Urshanabi, empty-handed, no immortality, no youth regained, just crushing disappointment.
So is that the end? He gets back to Uruk. End of story.
Not quite the end of the standard epic. When they arrive back, Gilgamesh looks at Uruk. He sees the massive city walls, this incredible structure built by human hands.
The walls he might have forced his people to build earlier.
Possibly the very same ones. And something clicks for him. He turns to Urshanabi and starts praising the walls, their strength, their permanence.
Ah, so he finds a different kind of immortality.
Exactly. Not for himself, personally, but in the legacy he leaves behind, in the achievements of his city, his people. It's a shift, a realization that enduring works, community, maybe that's where meaning lies for mortals. A very mature conclusion, really.
Finding meaning in legacy, not eternal life. That's powerful.
Yeah.
Now, you mentioned 12 tablets. What about tablet 12? I hear it's a bit different.
You heard right. Tablet 12 feels very separate. Most scholars think it was added later. It's basically an Akkadian translation of an older, independent Sumerian story called Gilgamesh and the Netherworld.
So it doesn't quite fit.
Not really. The biggest clue, Enkidu is suddenly alive again.
What? But he died. We went through his whole death and Gilgamesh's grief.
I know, it's inconsistent. In this tablet, Gilgamesh loses some objects, they fall into the underworld. Enkidu offers to go get them back. Gilgamesh warns him specifically what not to do down there.
Let me guess. Enkidu does exactly what he was told not to do.
Bingo. He breaks the rules, gets trapped by the spirits of the dead. Gilgamesh prays to the gods, and eventually Shamash creates a crack in the earth so Enkidu's ghost can pop up and tell Gilgamesh what the afterlife is like.
Weird. Why tack that on if it doesn't fit the story?
Good question. Scholars aren't totally sure. Maybe the editor, Sinlock Unini, or someone later, wanted to give a clearer picture of the Mesopotamian afterlife. Or maybe connect the epic Gilgamesh back to other Sumerian legends where he's linked to the underworld, sometimes as a judge down there. It does kind of circle back to the he who saw the deep theme, seeing hidden realities. But yeah, it feels a bit like an appendix.
Interesting. And besides the standard version and this odd tablet 12, there were those earlier versions you mentioned.
Yeah.
The Old Babylonian and the Sumerian poems.
Right. The old Babylonian fragments, like Surpassing All Other Kings, they give us glimpses of earlier stages, sometimes with different focuses. The original 5 Sumerian poems, they're now seen mostly as separate stories about Gilgamesh.
Gilgamesh.
Yeah, possibly the earlier Sumerian form of the name. These stories sometimes have different details, like in the Sumerian Cedar Forest tale, Enkidu is more of the strategist, and they might have other companions. There's also a Sumerian story about Gilgamesh and a king named Aga of Kish. Nothing like it in the main epic, but it touches on themes like mercy and listening to elders.
And there's even a Sumerian story about Gilgamesh's death.
Yes, which is fascinating because the main epic ends with him accepting his mortality and focusing on his city's legacy. The Sumerian poem actually describes his death, his burial, and him becoming a sort of semi-divine figure in the underworld. So different traditions offered different endings for him.
It's amazing how these stories twist and turn over centuries. Which brings us to the epic's influence. It didn't just disappear, did it? It clearly impacted later cultures.
Oh, massively. The connections to the Hebrew Bible are probably the most studied. You've got the Garden of Eden parallels with Enkidu, Shamhat, the wild man tamed by a woman, gaining knowledge, leaving his old home.
And the snake stealing the plant.
Exactly. Though key differences remain, like Enkidu not being punished in the same way Adam was. Then there's Siduri's advice.
The alewife who told him to enjoy life.
Yeah, her advice, cherish your family, find joy in mortal things, sounds remarkably like passages in the book of Ecclesiastes. Some scholars think there might be direct borrowing there.
And the flood story, of course.
That's the big one. The Utnapishtim flood story is so incredibly close to the Noah story in Genesis, the boat, the reasons, the birds, the sacrifice. It's almost certain they come from a common Mesopotamian source tradition.
Any other biblical links?
There are other proposed ones. Nebuchadnezzar's madness in Daniel might echo Enkidu's wildness. Some see links between Minti's creation from Enki's rib and Eve from Adam's rib. Maybe even Gilgamesh and Enkidu's wrestling match parallels Jacob and Esau, or Jacob and the angel. And Gilgamesh actually pops up in the Book of Giants, an apocryphal text.
Wow. It's woven into the fabric of the ancient Near East. What about Greece? Did Homer know Gilgamesh?
It's highly likely there was influence. Scholars point to themes, plot points, character types, even specific phrases in the Iliad and the Odyssey that seem to echo Gilgamesh. Gilgamesh himself, this powerful, flawed hero on an epic journey. He feels like a precursor to figures like Achilles and Odysseus.
A blend of the Iliad's power and the Odyssey's wanderings.
You could definitely see it that way. Some even think the legends might have traveled west through stories about Heracles or Hercules, who share some similarities.
And Alexander the Great, he was influenced too.
Seems so. The later legends about Alexander, especially his quest for the fountain of life, eternal youth, that seems directly inspired by Gilgamesh's quest for the plant or for Utnapishtim.
Though Alexander looked for water, not a plant.
Right. And in Alexander's stories, it's often a fish that gets rejuvenated by the water, not a snake stealing a plant. The core idea, the hero seeking eternal life, persists, but the details change with the culture.
It's fascinating how these motifs travel and transform. And Gilgamesh is still around today in popular culture.
Absolutely. After being basically lost to the West for centuries, it had this big rediscovery, especially after World War I, and its influence has just grown. Literature, art, music. A famous example is Hayao Miyazaki's film Princess Mononoke.
Really? How is that linked?
Many see strong parallels, especially with the Cedar Forest episode. The conflict between humanity and nature, the powerful forest spirits. It draws on that ancient conflict Gilgamesh and Enkidu faced.
It's amazing to think this story was lost for so long.
Yeah.
How did we actually get it back? Tell us about the rediscovery.
It's a great story in itself. Back in the 1850s, archaeologists were digging in Nineveh, in the ruins of Ashurbanipal's library. They found something like 15,000 broken clay tablet fragments.
15,000. Just a massive jigsaw puzzle.
Exactly. The British Museum hired George Smith, a brilliant self-taught Assyriologist, to try and make sense of them. In 1872, he announced he'd found a flood story on these tablets that was incredibly similar to Noah's, caused a huge sensation.
I bet. That must have rocked people.
Totally. Smith kept working, piecing more together. At first, they thought the hero's name was Izdubar, but later scholars figured out the correct reading was Gilgamesh.
And others continued the work.
Oh, yes. Scholars like Haupt, Jensen, Thompson, and crucially, Samuel Noah Kramer, who did amazing work on the earlier Sumerian poems. It's been this long, slow process of piecing fragments together. Just imagine, as recently as 1998, a fragment already in the British Museum was identified as containing the very first lines of the standard epic.
Incredible, like finding the lost first page. Is there any actual proof Gilgamesh was a real person?
No definitive proof, but some tantalizing clues. They found artifacts linked to a king named Enmebaragesi of Kish.
Okay.
And Enmebarazi is mentioned in the legends as the father of an adversary of Gilgamesh. Since Enmebarazi seems historical, dating around 2600 BCE, it adds weight to the idea that Gilgamesh might have been a real king of Uruk whose exploits became legendary.
So maybe a real king behind the myth. And there was that recent controversy with one of the tablets, right? The Dream Tablet.
Yes, that's a whole modern saga. A tablet known as the Gilgamesh Dream Tablet was looted from Iraq, illegally imported into the U.S. sometime in the early 2000s.
And bought by Hobby Lobby.
Exactly, for their Museum of the Bible. But its illegal origins came to light. U.S. officials seized it in 2019, and thankfully, it was returned to Iraq in 2021. A really important moment for cultural heritage repatriation.
A reminder that these aren't just stories, they're artifacts with complex histories. And technology is helping find more pieces now.
It is. Artificial intelligence is actually being used now to scan images of fragments scattered in museums worldwide. The AI can spot potential joins between broken pieces much faster than humans can.
So AI might help us complete more of the puzzle.
That's the hope. It's accelerating the discovery process, which is incredibly exciting. We might uncover even more of this ancient story.
What an incredible journey we followed today. From Gilgamesh, the maybe king, to the epic hero, lost and rediscovered, influencing millennia of storytelling.
It really covers the whole sweep of human history.
So wrapping up this deep dive, we've seen Gilgamesh change so profoundly. From that tyrant king to a heartbroken friend to the desperate seeker of eternal life, and finally, finding peace, maybe, in the legacy of his city's walls.
A journey towards accepting mortality and finding meaning within it.
It really is a foundational story, isn't it? Exploring these huge themes. Friendship, loss, fear of death, the search for meaning, things we still grapple with constantly.
Absolutely. They feel as relevant today as they must have 4,000 years ago.
Which leads to our final thought for you, our listener. Thinking about everything we've discussed, the friendship, the grief, the fear, the search for something lasting. What part of Gilgamesh's human journey resonates most with you today?
What does this incredibly ancient poem tell us about what truly endures in the human condition, right across the millennia? Something to mull over.
Definitely. We really encourage you to explore the Epic of Gilgamesh further if this has sparked your interest, and the amazing history of Mesopotamia, too. It's a path back to the dawn of storytelling and to questions that are still profoundly human.
Welcome to the deep dive. Today, we're plunging into the, well, frankly, astonishing realm of viruses.
Hi there. Yeah, these submicroscopic agents that somehow manage to replicate inside living cells. It's pretty wild.
Totally wild. And what blows my mind is they infect everything. Every kind of life, everywhere. They're literally the most numerous biological things on the planet.
It's a number that's hard to even grasp, isn't it? And they're so tiny, mostly invisible, even with a standard microscope.
Right, yet they have this massive impact. So it makes sense why people are curious, why we're curious about this hidden world.
Definitely. And understanding them is, well, it's crucial.
Absolutely. So for this deep dive, we've pulled together a whole lot of information. We're looking at the basics, like what even is a virus? Where do they come from?
And also their structure, how they actually work, how we classify them, and of course, their impact on us, on the environment. It's a big picture.
It really is. Our mission today, to kind of sift through all that and pull out the really key things, the surprising stuff.
Exactly. We want to give you, our listener, a clear, engaging picture without, drowning you in jargon.
Okay, let's dive in. The most basic question. What is a virus? Fundamentally.
Okay, so fundamentally, it's a submicroscopic infectious agent. The key thing. It absolutely needs a host cell to replicate. It can't do it on its own.
Needs a host, period. Outside a cell, it's just sitting there.
Pretty much.
Yeah.
It exists as this inert particle called a virion, waiting.
And this virion particle, what's it made of? What's the basic structure?
Well, a typical one has a few essential parts. You've got the genetic material that's either DNA or RNA, the instructions, basically.
The blueprint.
Right. And that's protected by a protein coat called a capsid.
Okay.
And then some viruses, especially ones that infect animals, like influenza or HIV.
HIV, the virus behind AIDS.
Correct. Human immunodeficiency virus causing acquired immunodeficiency syndrome. Those often have an extra outer layer, a lipid envelope, which they usually steal from the host cell membrane when they leave.
Wow, they steal a cope on the way out. So tiny packages of instructions. Now, how tiny are we actually talking? Submicroscopic is vague.
It is vague. Most are just incredibly small compared to bacteria. Think 20 to 300 nanometers in diameter.
Meters, okay. Put that in perspective.
It means most are way too small for a regular light microscope. You need an electron microscope to actually see them.
That's mind-bendingly small. Makes you wonder how we even discovered them. But you said most, so there are bigger ones.
Oh, yeah. And they're super interesting. We now know about these giant viruses. Like mimivirus, its capsid can be around 400 nanometers.
Getting closer to bacteria size then.
Getting there. And then things like megavirus chilensis showed up, even visible with a basic optical scope.
Yeah.
And the Pandora viruses, their genomes are huge, twice the size of mimivirus. They really mess with the old definitions.
Okay, wow. So they have genes, a shell. They evolve. Are they alive? That's the classic debate, right?
Ah, yes, the big question. They have genes, they definitely evolved by natural selection, and they reproduce by making copies.
Oh, but they don't have cells.
Exactly. No cellular structure. And crucially, no metabolism of their own. They completely depend on the host cell's machinery to build new virus parts.
So they can't just make more viruses by themselves. They need to invade and take over?
Precisely. That's why they've been called organisms at the edge of life. Or sometimes just replicators.
Organisms at the edge of life. I like that. It captures the weirdness.
There's also this idea, the virus cell model, gaining traction. It suggests the infected cell is the true living form of the virus.
Huh. So the virion particle is more like a seed or a spore?
Kind of, yeah. A delivery vehicle to get to the next host cell. It's a different way of thinking about it.
Okay, fascinating. Let's switch gears. Origins. Where did these edge-of-life things come from? They don't leave fossils, do they?
Right. No fossil bones. That makes it tough.
Yeah.
But we have clues from molecular techniques, like finding bits of ancient viral DNA stuck inside the genomes of organisms today.
Like ghosts in the machine.
Sort of. It's a field called paleovirology. We can find traces of viruses from millions of years ago, sometimes even integrated into our own DNA.
Amazing. But what are the main theories for how they started?
There are basically three big ideas. First, the regressive hypothesis. Maybe they were once small parasitic cells that lost genes they didn't need anymore.
Got simpler over time.
Yeah, streamlined for a parasitic life. Some bacteria, like Rickettsia and Chlamydia, only live inside host cells and have also lost genes, so it's plausible. It's also called the degeneracy hypothesis.
Interesting. So devolution, in a way. What's the second theory?
That's the cellular origin, or escape hypothesis. The idea here is that viruses came from bits of DNA or RNA that somehow escaped from the genes of larger organisms.
Escaped genes. Like what?
Maybe from things like plasmids, those small DNA circles that move between cells, or transposons, jumping genes that move around within a genome.
Jumping genes, like Barbara McClintock discovered in corn.
Exactly. Her work showed these mobile genetic elements exist. Maybe some learned to jump between cells, eventually becoming viruses. It's also called the vagrancy hypothesis.
Sounds like science fiction. What's the third idea?
The coevolution, or virus-first hypothesis. This suggests viruses might have evolved from complex molecules, proteins, and nucleic acids right alongside the very first cells.
So they didn't come from cells, but emerged with them.
That's the idea. They would have been dependent on cellular life from the get-go. Things like viroids, just naked RNA loops, or satellites that need other viruses to replicate, like Sputnik virofuge needing nimivirus. They might be relics of these early stages.
So naked RNA, helper viruses, maybe steps along the way.
Potentially, yeah. Clues to how complexity might have built up.
But each of these hypotheses had problems initially, right?
They did. The regressive one didn't explain why simple parasites still don't look like viruses structurally. The escape idea struggled with explaining complex capsids, and virus first seemed to clash with the definition that viruses need hosts.
So where do things stand now? Has the view changed?
Very much so. We now think viruses are incredibly ancient, likely predating the split of life into the three domains: bacteria, archaea, eukarya.
Older than we thought.
Much older. And this ancient origin means the old hypotheses are being looked at again. The modern view is less about one single origin.
Ah, so maybe they arose multiple times in different ways.
Exactly. It seems more likely that viruses emerged multiple times through various mechanisms. Discoveries in the RNA world, computational analyses, they're helping piece together this complex history, even if one neat origin story is, well, probably not out there.
A tangled web of origins. Okay, let's get practical. How do they work? The replication cycle. How do they take over a cell?
Okay, so while it varies a lot, there are generally 6 basic stages. First up is attachment.
Sticking to the cell.
Right, it's very specific. Proteins on the virus surface bind to particular receptor molecules on the host cell surface, like a key fitting into a lock.
And that lock and key thing determines which cells it can infect.
Precisely. That dictates the virus's host range. Think HIV, its GP120 protein, specifically targets the CD4 receptor on certain human immune cells. Without that match, no infection.
Got it. Molecular docking. So once it's attached, how does it get inside?
Stage 2, penetration, or viral entry. In animal cells, it often happens through endocytosis. The cell membrane kind of swallows the virus whole.
Like Pac-Man.
A bit.
Yeah.
Or for enveloped viruses, the viral envelope can fuse directly with the cell membrane, releasing the inside stuff.
And plants. Fungi. They have tough cell walls.
They do. Cellulose in plants, chitin in fungi. So viruses usually need some kind of physical damage, like an insect bite, to get in. Though plant viruses can sneak between cells through tiny channels called plasmodesmata.
Clever. And bacteria, also tough walls.
Yep. Some bacteriophages, the viruses that infect bacteria, have evolved these amazing syringe-like mechanisms to inject just their genetic material through the wall, leaving the capsid outside.
Like a little lunar lander delivering its payload. Okay, virus or its genome is inside. What's next?
Stage 3, uncoating. The capsid breaks down, releasing the viral genome, the DNA or RNA, into the cell's interior.
Setting the instructions free.
Exactly. This can be triggered by viral enzymes, host enzymes, or sometimes the capsid just falls apart in the new environment.
Okay, the viral genes are loose. Now the takeover begins.
Pretty much. Stage 4, replication. This is the core business. First, the virus needs to make messenger RNA, mRNA, from its genes, often called early genes.
Using its own instructions, but the cell's machinery.
Right. The host cell's ribosomes read the viral mRNA and start making viral proteins. These early proteins are often enzymes needed for the next step, copying the viral genome. making lots of DNA or RNA copies.
So hijack the protein factory, then the copy machine.
You got it. And for more complex viruses, there might be a second wave of late gene expression, making the structural proteins needed to build new virus particles. The cell is now working for the virus.
A zombie cell, almost. What's the step after making all the parts?
Stage 5. Assembly. All those newly made viral genomes and proteins start coming together to form new variants.
Do they need help assembling?
Often it's a self-assembly process.
Right.
The parts just naturally fit together based on their shapes and charges. Sometimes there are modifications, like protein trimming in HIV, to make the final particle infectious. It's like an assembly line within the cell.
Building the next generation of invaders. And finally, how do they get out?
Stage 6.
Yeah.
Release. Several ways this happens. One is the cell just bursts open, releasing all the new viruses at once. Common for bacteriophages and some animal viruses. Kills the cell, obviously.
That's the exit. What else?
Some viruses go into a lysogenic cycle. They integrate their genome into the host's chromosome, like hiding out.
Latency.
Yeah, becoming a provirus or prophage. It gets copied along with the host DNA when the cell divides. Then later, maybe years later, it can activate, start making viruses, and then often lay lace at the cell.
Sneaky. Any other ways out?
Yes, budding. This is typical for enveloped viruses, like HIV. The new virus particle pushes out through the cell membrane, taking a piece of that membrane with it as its envelope.
Stealing that code again? Does that kill the cell?
Not always, or at least not immediately. The cell can sometimes survive and keep releasing viruses for a while.
Lysis, latency, budding. Quite the range of strategies. It's amazing. Now, you mentioned DNA or RNA genomes. Let's dig into that genetic diversity. It's pretty wild, right?
Oh, absolutely. Viral genomes are collectively way more diverse structurally than all other life forms combined. Plants, animals, bacteria, viruses beat them all for genomic variety.
That's a huge statement. What drives that diversity?
Well, first, the basic DNA versus RNA thing. And within that, RNA genomes are actually more common overall.
Really? I'd have guessed DNA.
Nope, lots of RNA out there,
Yeah.
especially single-stranded RNA, ssRNA, in plant viruses. Bacteriophages often favor double-stranded DNA, dsDNA. And then you have retroviruses like HIV, which are RNA but use a DNA intermediate step.
They switch between codes.
Temporarily, yeah, using an enzyme called reverse transcriptase. It adds another layer of complexity.
Okay, what about the shape? Are they all just long strings?
Not at all. Genomes can be circular, like in polyomaviruses, or linear, like adenoviruses.
Circles or lines?
And then there's segmentation. Many RNA viruses and some DNA ones have their genome broken up into separate pieces or segments.
Like chapters in a book?
Kind of.
Yeah.
Each segment often codes for just one protein. And get this, for some, not all segments even need to be in the same virus particle to cause an infection.
Wait, what? You only need part of the instruction manual?
It seems that way sometimes. As long as the cell gets infected by particles carrying the full set eventually, it can work. It's wild.
Facilitates reassortment, too.
We'll come back to reassortment. What about single versus double strands?
Most are either single-stranded, SS, or double-stranded, DSS. But again, exceptions. Hepatoviruses, like hepatitis B.
Hep B.
Their genome is partly double-stranded, partly single-stranded. A weird hybrid? Always breaking the rules. I've also heard positive sense and negative sense RNA. What's that about?
Right. This applies to most RNA viruses and some ssDNA ones. It's about their relationship to messenger RNA, mRNA.
The cell's protein recipe book.
Exactly. Positive sense plus RNA is like mRNA itself.
Yeah.
The cell's ribosomes can read it directly and start making protein immediately.
Ready to go.
Ready to go.
Okay.
Negative sense. RNA is like the opposite strand, the template. It can't be read directly. The virus has to bring its own enzyme to copy it, and to positive sense, mRNA first.
So an extra step for negative sense.
Yes, and some are even ambiscinded. They can make mRNA from both strands. More variations.
Different genetic operating systems. And the size. I bet that varies wildly, too.
Hugely. Tiny little circle viruses have genomes of about 2,000 bases, coding for just 2 proteins.
2 proteins? That's minimal.
Extremely minimal. Then you jump to the other end, the Pandora viruses. Their genomes are around 2 million bases, coding for maybe 2,500 proteins.
Whoa. That's bigger than some bacteria.
It is. Blurs the lines again. So, from a tiny pamphlet to a massive encyclopedia.
How do the small ones pack enough info? Even the slightly larger ones.
Overlapping genes are common. One stretch of DNA or RNA can code for parts of different proteins, read in different frames. Very efficient use of space.
Clever coding. Any general rules about RNA versus DNA genome size?
Generally, RNA viruses tend to have smaller genomes. Why? The enzymes that copy RNA make more mistakes, a higher error rate.
More mutations.
Yes. And if the genome gets too big, too many errors accumulate, and it's non-functional. So there's an upper size limit, generally. Segmentation helps them get around this a bit.
Breaking it into smaller pieces reduces the chance of a fatal error in any one piece.
That's the thinking. DNA viruses, on the other hand, usually have more accurate copying enzymes proofreading, so they can maintain larger genomes.
But there are exceptions.
Always. Single-stranded DNA viruses can actually have pretty high mutation rates, closer to RNA viruses sometimes.
It's just incredible diversity. And this ties into how they adapt so quickly, resist drugs. How do they change genetically?
They are masters of change. One key way is antigenic drift. These are small, gradual changes point mutations, like typos in the viral genes.
Like we just discussed with RNA viruses.
Exactly. Most mutations might do nothing or be harmful. But occasionally, one gives an advantage. Maybe it helps the virus evade the immune system slightly better or
resist an antiviral drug.
Precisely. Even a single amino acid change in a key protein can sometimes make a drug useless. That's drift.
Small changes, big consequences. What else?
There's a big one, antigenic shift. This involves major, abrupt changes to the genome.
How does that happen?
Through things like recombination, where different virus strains infecting the same cell swap chunks of genetic material. Or, especially in segmented viruses like influenza, through reassortment. If a cell is infected with two different flu strains, a human one and a bird one, the segments can get mixed and matched when new viruses are assembled.
Like shuffling genetic cards.
Exactly. You can get a completely new combination of segments, creating a novel virus strain that our immune systems haven't seen before. That's often how pandemics start. It's like, well, you called it viral sex earlier.
Yeah. Yes, it does sound like it. Creating unique offspring. I've also heard of quasi-species. What's that?
Right. Many RNA viruses, because of that high mutation rate, don't exist as just one single sequence. They exist as a cloud, a swarm of slightly different genetic variants. That's a quasi-species.
A population of mutants.
Sort of. It means there's constant variation within the infected host. If conditions change, maybe the immune system attacks, or an antiviral drug is used, there's a higher chance that some variant within that quasi-species cloud already has a mutation that allows it to survive and take over.
Built-in adaptability through diversity.
It's a powerful strategy. Natural selection has a lot to work with there.
And recombination, you mentioned, swapping bits. How common is that?
It's known to happen in lots of viruses, both RNA and DNA. It's another way they generate novelty. In coronaviruses, for example, the enzyme that copies their RNA seems to be able to jump between template strands.
Template switching.
Yeah. It might be a way they repair damage to their rather large RNA genomes, but it also leads to recombination if different viral RNAs are present.
So many ways to change. It's a constant arms race.
Okay, let's talk impact. Viruses and human disease. We know the common ones.
Sure. The common cold, flu, chicken pox, cold sores. Things most people experience.
But they also cause really serious stuff.
Absolutely. Rabies, Ebola, AIDS from HIV, avian flu, SARS, MERS, COVID-19. The list of severe viral diseases is long and, frankly, frightening. We talk about virulence, how good a virus is at causing disease.
Right. And how do they actually make us sick? What's happening at the cellular level?
A major way is just killing cells lysis. The virus replicates so much inside a cell that it just bursts. If enough important cells die, you get disease symptoms.
Organ damage, essentially. Or disruption of function. Even without killing cells outright, viruses can mess up their normal processes, disrupting homeostasis, the body's stable internal environment.
And latency, you mentioned that earlier, hiding out.
Yes. Some viruses, like herpes viruses, herpes simplex, cold sores, genital herpes, Epstein-Barr, mono, varicella zoster, chickenpox shingles, can go dormant in nerve cells or other places.
Lurking.
Pretty much. They're not actively causing disease, but they can reactivate later, often when the immune system is stressed. Interestingly, there's some evidence these latent viruses might occasionally offer some minor benefits, like maybe slightly boosting immunity against bacteria. It's complex.
A very strange relationship. What about chronic infections, where the virus never really goes away?
Right, like chronic hepatitis B or C. The virus keeps replicating, often for years, sometimes causing ongoing damage, like liver disease. The person might not feel sick initially, but can still transmit the virus.
The carriers.
Exactly. They act as reservoirs, helping the disease persist in a population, sometimes becoming endemic.
Which leads us to epidemiology, how viruses spread. How does that work?
Epidemiology tracks how infections move through populations. We talk about vertical transmission, mother to child, during pregnancy or birth or breastfeeding. HIV and Hep B can spread this way.
Okay. And person-person?
That's horizontal transmission. Lots of routes here. Sexual contact, blood exchange, saliva, contaminated food or water, breathing in aerosols from coughs or sneezes.
Respiratory droplets.
Right. Or insect vectors like mosquitoes transmitting Zika or West Nile virus. Different viruses prefer different routes.
And what makes an outbreak more or less likely?
Several things matter. Population density, easier spread in crowded cities. The number of susceptible people, those without immunity from past infection or vaccines.
So the herd immunity concept comes in there.
Exactly. Also, healthcare quality, sanitation, travel patterns, even weather can play a role.
So tracking all that helps control outbreaks.
Yeah.
What are the main strategies?
First step is always identify the virus and the source. Then, if a vaccine exists, that's key. If not, things like sanitation, disinfection, isolating infected people are crucial.
Isolation and quarantine.
Yes. Contact tracing, finding out who an infected person might have exposed. Sometimes, for animal diseases, culling infected herds is necessary. Understanding the incubation period, time from infection to symptoms, and communicability period when someone is infectious is vital for timing these measures correctly.
We've certainly seen the impact of pandemics. Which ones stand out historically?
Oh, definitely the 1918 influenza pandemic, the Spanish flu, killed tens of millions worldwide, a catastrophic event.
Unimaginable scale back then.
Truly. Then there's HIV/AIDS emerging in the 80s, a global crisis still ongoing, though treatments have improved dramatically. We've also had several other flu pandemics in the 20th century.
And more recently.
Ebola outbreaks in Africa, always terrifying due to the high fatality rate. SARS in 2003, MERS later, both coronaviruses that cause global alerts.
Which brings us to COVID-19, SARS-CoV-2, from bats originally.
That's the leading theory, yes. And the impact was, well, unprecedented in modern times. Global travel bans, lockdowns, mask mandates. It changed everything for a while.
A stark reminder of viral potential. Now, besides acute illness, there's also the link to cancer.
Yes, that's established now. Certain viruses, called oncoviruses, can contribute to cancer development. It's not that infection guarantees cancer, far from it. It depends on many factors, host immunity, other mutations.
That they can be a trigger.
They can. We know specific types of human papillomavirus, HPV, cause most cervical cancers, and others. Hepatitis B and C are major causes of liver cancer. Epstein-Barr virus is linked to some lymphomas. Kaposi's sarcoma virus, HTLV1, Merkel cell polyoma virus. Several are implicated. Both RNA and DNA viruses can be oncoviruses.
It's sobering. So, with all these threats, how does our body fight back? The immune system.
Our defenses are amazing, really. First line is the innate immune system. It's fast, nonspecific, recognizes general danger signals like foreign RNA or proteins.
The immediate response team.
Right. Includes things like inflammation, fever, and cellular mechanisms like RNA interference, chopping up viral double-stranded RNA. Some viruses, like rotavirus, try to hide their dsRNA to avoid this.
Clever evasion. What about targeted long-term defense?
That's the adaptive immune system. It learns to recognize specific invaders. Key players are antibodies produced by B cells.
Antibodies, like tiny targeted missiles.
Good analogy. They bind specifically to viral proteins, neutralizing the virus or tagging it for destruction by other immune cells. We measure IgM antibodies for recent infection, IgG for past infection or immunity. There's even a protein inside cells, TRM21, that helps destroy antibody-coated viruses that get inside.
So antibodies work outside and inside cells.
TRM21 allows for that intracellular defense boost, yes. The other major arm is cell-mediated immunity run by T cells.
T cells, what do they do?
Some T cells, the killer T cells or cytotoxic T lymphocytes, recognize viral proteins displayed on the surface of infected cells and kill those cells directly.
Taking out the virus factories.
Exactly. Other T cells, helper T cells, coordinate the overall immune response, activating B cells and killer T cells. Macrophages and other cells present the viral fragments to T cells to get things started.
A coordinated attack. Anything else?
Interferon is important too. It's a signaling molecule produced by infected cells that warns neighboring cells and makes them more resistant to infection, and it can also trigger infected cells to die.
Sounds like a formidable defense network.
Mm-hmm.
But viruses evade it, as we know. How?
They have so many tricks. HIV is famous for escape mutations, constantly changing its surface protein so antibodies don't recognize it anymore.
Constant disguise changes.
Yep. Some viruses hide in places the immune system doesn't easily reach, like nerve cells. Neurotropic viruses. They can block antigen presentation so infected cells don't signal they're infected. They can resist interferon, evade killer cells, block apoptosis, cell suicide.
Wow.
And then there's antigenic shift, the big genome change we talked about, which can make previous immunity totally useless. It's a constant battle of measures and countermeasures.
An evolutionary arms race playing out inside us. So this brings us to how we fight back medically. Prevention and treatment.
The two main pillars are vaccines for prevention and antiviral drugs for treatment.
Vaccines first. Hugely successful, right?
Immensely. Vaccination is one of public health's greatest triumphs. Diseases like polio, measles, mumps, dramatically reduced. Smallpox completely eradicated, an incredible achievement.
Eradicated.
Globally gone, thanks to vaccines. We now have vaccines for over a dozen human viral diseases, plus many animal ones.
How do they work? Different types.
Several types. Live attenuated use a weakened virus that replicates a bit but doesn't cause serious illness, giving strong immunity. Think MMR, measles, mumps, rubella.
Okay.
Inactivated or killed vaccines use virus particles that can't replicate at all. Subunit vaccines use just purified pieces of the virus, like specific proteins. And newer ones are RNA vaccines, delivering genetic instructions for our cells to make a viral protein, triggering immunity.
RNA vaccines, like for COVID-19, are some safer than others.
Generally, subunit and inactivated vaccines are considered very safe, even for people with weak immune systems, because they can't cause infection. Live vaccines are highly effective, but carry a very small risk for the severely immunocompromised. The yellow fever vaccine, a live one, is often hailed as one of the safest and most effective ever made.
Vaccines are amazing for prevention, but if you do get infected, antivirals.
Yes, antiviral drugs aim to stop the virus from replicating. It's tricky, though, because viruses use our own cell machinery.
Right. Hard to target the virus without hurting the host cell.
Exactly. But we've found ways. Many antivirals are nucleoside analogs. They look like the building blocks of DNA or RNA, but they're fakes.
Counterfeit bricks.
Good way to put it. When the virus tries to use them to build new genomes, it messes up the process, often stopping it cold. Aciclovir for herpes, Lemivune for HIV and Hep B are examples.
Clever sabotage. Any other targets?
Oh yes. We have drugs that target specific viral enzymes the virus needs, but our cells don't, or that are very different. Protease inhibitors for HIV stop the virus from maturing properly. We have drugs blocking entry, uncoding, assembly. About 13 different classes now targeting different steps.
Progress, especially for things like hepatitis C.
Huge progress there. Direct-acting antivirals, the AAs, can now cure most hepatitis C infections. And drugs like lamivudine offer good control for hepatitis B. It shows what targeted drug development can achieve.
Really encouraging. Now, we focused a lot on humans, but viruses infect everything else too, right?
Oh, absolutely. Every type of cell we know of has viruses that infect it. Animals, plants, fungi, bacteria, archaea.
Even viruses infecting other viruses?
Well, sort of. Satellites need a helper virus co-infecting the same cell to replicate. So yeah, layers of dependency.
What about animals generally, besides humans?
Viruses cause major livestock diseases, foot and mouth, blue tongue, huge economic impact. Pets get viral diseases too, like parvovirus in dogs, hence vaccinations. Honeybees are hit hard by certain viruses. But, just like in humans, many viruses live in animals without causing any harm.
Part of their natural microbiome, maybe. And plants.
Plant viruses are everywhere, often reduce crop yields, causing spots, wilting, stunted growth. Big problem for agriculture.
How do they spread?
Mostly through vectors. Insects feeding on plants are major culprits. Also, fungi, nematodes in the soil, even parasitic plants can transmit them.
Can we catch plant viruses?
Nope, they're highly specific to plant cells. Can't replicate in animals. Plants have their own defenses too, specific resistance genes, RNA interference, producing antiviral chemicals.
Like salicylic acid, aspirin's relative.
Exactly. Plants make it as a defense signal. And interestingly, plant virus particles are now being used in biotech and nanotech because they form these perfect uniform structures. Potato virus Y is a big one economically, causes huge losses.
Fascinating reuse. And bacteria have their viruses too, bacteriophages.
Yes, phages. They are incredibly abundant, especially in water. Oceans, rivers, teeming with them. They infect specific bacteria.
Nature's bacteria controllers.
Definitely. They attach, inject their genes, replicate like crazy. Sometimes hundreds burst out of one bacterium in minutes. Bacteria fight back, though. They have restriction enzymes to cut up viral DNA and CRISPR systems.
CRISPR, the gene editing tool, it started as bacterial defense.
That's right. It's an adaptive immune system for bacteria and archaea, remembering and targeting phage DNA. Some phages can also go dormant, hiding as prophages in the bacterial genome.
So bacteria have their own latent viruses too. What about archaea, the other microbes?
Archaea have their own viruses too, often DNA viruses, and some have really weird shapes, spindles, bottles, things not seen elsewhere, mostly studied in archaea living in extreme environments, like hot springs. And yes, they also use CRISPR and RNA interference for defense.
It's a whole viral world out there. You mentioned phages in water. What's the bigger ecological impact of viruses?
It's massive, especially in the oceans. Viruses are the most numerous biological entities there. Phages killing bacteria, other viruses killing algae, phytoplankton. This has huge effects.
How so?
When they lyse microbes, they release all the nutrients and organic matter locked inside those cells back into the water. It's called the viral shunt.
A nutrient recycling program.
Exactly. It fuels the growth of other microbes and influences global cycles of carbon, nitrogen, phosphorus. They also control plankton blooms. And they might affect how much carbon sinks to the deep ocean, the biological pump.
Wow, tiny viruses influencing climate regulation.
Potentially, yes. It's estimated they kill something like 20% of the ocean's microbial biomass every day. And we're finding marine viruses deposited from the atmosphere all over the planet.
Raining viruses.
Literally. And just recently, scientists found the first case of something eating viruses virovory. A little ciliate called Halteria was seen munching on chloroviruses.
Viruses on the menu. That changes things. And their role in evolution.
Also profound. Viruses are major drivers of horizontal gene transfer moving genes between unrelated organisms. This shuffles the genetic deck, creates novelty, speeds up evolution.
So they're not just destroyers, they're creators too, in a way.
Absolutely. They likely played a huge role in early life's evolution. And the vast majority of viral genes out there are still unknown. A massive reservoir of unexplored genetic diversity.
Mind-boggling. Okay, finally, how are we actively using viruses now? Applications.
Lots of ways, actually. In basic biology, there are simple models to study fundamental processes, DNA replication, gene expression.
Teaching tools.
Yes. And as vectors in gene therapy, using a harmless virus to deliver a correct copy of a gene to cells lacking it, or in virotherapy engineering viruses to specifically target and kill cancer cells.
Fighting fire with fire?
Kind of. And phage therapy is making a comeback, using bacteriophages to treat antibiotic-resistant bacterial infections. Plus, using viral vectors to produce proteins like vaccine antigens or therapeutic antibodies in cell cultures.
So medicine and research, what else?
Material science and nanotechnology are getting interested. Virus particles are like perfect little self-assembling nanoparticles.
Uniform building blocks.
Exactly. You can modify their surfaces, use them as scaffolds to build tiny structures, maybe for electronics or sensors. Cowpea mosaic virus is one they're using for this kind of thing. Directed evolution can tailor them for specific jobs.
Viruses as nanomaterials. Who'd have thought? What about making them from scratch? Synthetic viruses.
Yeah, we can do that now. Synthesize the DNA or RNA sequence chemically, put it into a cell, and get infectious viruses out.
Build a virus workshop. Why?
Primarily for research and developing new vaccine strategies, you can design specific features. The fact that thousands of viral genomes are sequenced and available online makes this more feasible. Raises ethical questions, of course.
Of course. Which leads to the final, darker application, weapons.
That's a concern, unfortunately. Because viruses can cause epidemics, the potential for biological warfare exists. The recreation of the 1918 flu virus in the lab caused a stir.
I remember that.
Yeah. And smallpox. Eradicated in the wild, but official stocks remain in secure labs in the U.S. and Russia. Since routine vaccination stopped decades ago, most of the world is susceptible again. The potential for misuse is sobering.
A sobering thought indeed. It really highlights the dual nature of these things. Powerful, complex.
Absolutely. This deep dive really shows that viruses are just incredibly diverse. They're ancient and they play these huge roles. Disease, yes, but also ecology, evolution, even technology now.
Yeah, definitely some aha moments. The whole edge of life debate, the mystery around their origins, how intricate replication is.
The sheer variety of genomes, that constant battle with our immune system, and then these surprising applications, both good and potentially bad.
It's a ton of information for sure.
It is. Virology is a huge field. But hopefully this overview gave you, our listeners, a good handle on the really key ideas without being too overwhelming.
And it leaves us thinking, with potentially millions of viruses still undiscovered out there, what else are they doing? What other impacts might they have on us, on the planet, in the future?
That's the big question, isn't it? A vast viral world still waiting to be explored.
Definitely food for thought. Thanks for joining us on this deep dive into the world of viruses.